Thanks for coming. Thanks for everyone tuning in online as well as in person. So Jeff, we're going to get into the nitty gritty, but before that, I thought I would ask, many people grow up wanting to be a lawyer. Some grow up wanting to be doctors. Did you grow up wanting to go into immigration law and to become an immigration judge?
Well, you just mentioned lawyer and doctor. Those were my only two choices growing up because I was raised in a Jewish family, a doctor's son. So my parents always said, you can be anything you want when you grow up as long as you want to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I knew I didn't want to be a doctor because I saw my father's life. But I had no idea what lawyer was because we didn't have any lawyers in the family. So I figured there must be something, in the law that I'll enjoy. And then when I started college, I had a roommate that was from Iran. And I think before then I wouldn't have been able to find Iran on a map, but suddenly I became fascinated by it and started to listen to him and his friends speak and write down words and say, what does this mean? What does that mean? And then shortly after, I met my wife, who had come here at the age of 18 from Iran. And we started dating at 19, and now we're married going on 36 years. But I ended up majoring in Middle Eastern languages and literature at NYU and studying graduate level courses in medieval Persian literature. And then it was, what am I going to do with this for a living? So I had some vague, I always say life is a series of accidents. So I had some vague idea of international law, not really knowing what that was. And then I started law school and just hated, property and contracts and all of these things and say, what did I do? But then people started asking me, oh, you're in law school, how do I get a green card? How do I get asylum? So I said, I guess I'll take a class in that second year. And then just from day one, I said, I know this is what I want to do. And I worked a couple of years for a firm that did immigration law. And then I went on my own, and I had the language skills in Persian, but the Iranian wave of immigration was really over by then, because this was now late 80s, and the Iranian wave was more late 70s, early 80s. But Afghanistan was being occupied by the Soviet Union, and half of the country speaks a dialect of Persian called Dari. And they heard there's this American lawyer that speaks their language. A lot of them at the beginning were detained, and I would go down to the immigration detention center and represent them. And I also was volunteering with what's now called Human Rights First, going down to the detention facility and speaking with people that need lawyers. And I'd come home and my wife would laugh and say, your Persian has become like an Afghan now, because I'd be talking all day. But it's really interesting how, I really went into it having no idea of where this was leading. And I had so many classmates in high school who had their whole life mapped out in ninth grade, and it often didn't follow that path. So I guess it's accidents, but taking advantage of those accidents.
Yeah, well, that's the fun of life, I think. So wanted to dig right in. Can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the immigration courts and the role of an immigration judge?
Can I talk a little bit about the history of it as well? Because, back in the Ellis Island days, there was someone in a uniform made a quick determination as to whether someone could come or not. And I believe the appeal process consisted of that person calling two colleagues over and them huddling for a minute. So, over the years, that there needed to be a more system involving more due process than that. But the judges really only started to even call themselves judges in the 70s and didn't officially get that title until 1996. Prior to 1974, they were called special inquiry officers, and they were lawyers working for the INS, and it was usually when INS made a determination that somebody shouldn't be here or wasn't entitled to what they were applying for, they would hear the case, but in a very non-court-like, non-judicial kind of way. And in 1974, the judges started to call themselves, as I said, immigration judges for the first time. And the person that was called the first chief immigration judge was a man named William Fliegelman, who happened to be in New York. And I'm going to say this with a lot of New York bias, because I'm a lifelong New Yorker. But when I would sit in Washington, D.C., in these headquarter kinds of meetings, and I would think, like, if I were to, God forbid, have like a heart attack right now, they would have 7 meetings about what to do, and then they'd have 3 meetings about, once they decided they should call an ambulance, who should call and what should the wording be, and they'd have a a special committee formed to draft the language. New Yorkers just do things. So because Judge Fliegelman was in New York, he didn't go through all of that. He just said, he knew the guy in the building that did construction. He said, could you make these offices look more like courtrooms? He told his people, just buy judicial robes. Don't worry, some way I'll get the money, to pay you back for it, which he eventually did. And he went and spoke to it was INS at that time, the INS District Council, and said, would you please send lawyers to act as prosecutors to make it more court-like? And kind of before Washington knew what had happened, there was this fait accompli that they were operating as courts. And it's really always been what my friend Debbie Anker at Harvard Law School calls a very bottom-up kind of institution, whereas most of the positive changes were driven by the judges themselves. The judges have had a strong union for many years, and it's really been against the resistance of the actual agency that they've managed to make many of the gains. The role of judges is to provide this type of independent, neutral review of decisions that are made by the agency, and it's supposed to be done by people that don't have a personal stake in the outcome, whose performance reviews aren't going to hinge on it, who aren't going to be told, oh, this is not what the agency wants to achieve. And I think by the 90s, the Judge Corps was really operating independently that way, and under Clinton really had hired up for the first time a large group of judges that were coming from not only outside of government, but that were very outspoken activists and that sort of thing, that weren't the usual lifetime government attorney. And I think that really changed the makeup of the Immigration Court in a very positive way at that time. But people come to the courts usually either what we call affirmatively or defensively. So affirmatively would be if someone is here and nobody is bothering them, and of their own, decision, they say, I'm going to apply for something. And DHS decides they're not eligible for it. They're often then referred to the Immigration Court, where they'll have another chance in front of a neutral judge who isn't part of the agency. And the defensive ones are people who did not want to be in the process, but were picked up either at the border or at the airport, or were arrested on some criminal charge, and then when they realized their immigration status were referred, and whatever they apply for is in a defensive posture, because they suddenly unexpectedly find themselves facing removal. And then every decision, if it's going to be appealed, gets appealed to one central appeals court called the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is located in Falls Church, Virginia. Am I going too long?
No, that's great. Okay. That's great. But speaking of differences, you've touched on the difference between affirmative and defensive. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between ICE check-ins and immigration hearings?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, because a lot of people first arriving here don't understand that these are two separate things. But the ICE check-ins are the agency that's regulating who's here and why, and whether they should be able to remain here. Having someone check in periodically to see what their current status is. So often, if they know they don't have a court hearing for 6 months, they'll tell them to come in after that time and see what happened at the hearing, and based on what happened, they'll adjust the next check-in date accordingly. But the court is where the actual case is taking place, and often when a person is released from custody, ICE tells them, okay, well, you next have to check in with ICE. At the New Sanctuary Coalition, we see a lot of people who were detained at the border or in Southern California or in Texas, and they're told, okay, check into 26 Federal Plaza on such and such a date and time. And that's also the same federal building where the courts are located, but they don't realize that there are two separate things. They don't realize that they have to make a change of venue now from the court. They think, oh, if they're telling me to check in New York, I guess the case has been moved to New York. And we've had people that do go to that first check-in and then are told, oh, you were ordered removed in absentia last week, and they really didn't know about it. And then it becomes not only the problem of having to get it reopened, but the fear of, in the meantime, that they're exposed to removal.
That's really helpful. And you've talked a little bit about how the titles of immigration judges have changed over time. Can you tell us a little bit about how the role of immigration judges has changed over kind of time as well?
Yeah, well, the proceedings have become much more, official, more court-like in the way that they evolve. When I first started, even, Hearings were a lot shorter than they tend to be now. But now you have to mark evidence, and there are more objections being raised. There are more witnesses, including expert witnesses, being called in cases. So it was pretty common when I first started, where judges would hear 4 full hearings in a day, and they really weren't. They didn't have to skip lunch or anything to do that. And now it's not uncommon that a case can take an entire day and still maybe not even be done. So the judges, I feel, are dealing with very complex legal legal issues these days, particularly where there's been a lot of change in case law, including decisions that the Attorney General has issued in order to change the law, and they haven't really been training the judges. The Attorney General will say, okay, here's a new decision that's about domestic violence cases or gang cases or family-based cases, but they then don't have a training for the immigration judge about how to interpret that decision. And we on the advocacy side have quickly been writing articles and creating trainings and materials, but the judges, we realize, need to be educated about these things. So that makes it even harder. Some of the new hirees don't even have immigration backgrounds. We've had some that are coming from the military JAG Corps, some that are coming from other kinds of courts, and we know how complicated this field is, even for those that do have a lot of experience in it. So I feel like part of the process is educating the judges.
Yeah. And how does the determination that someone becomes an immigration judge, how does that happen?
Yeah, they're technically appointed by the Attorney General, but they go through several levels of review before the Attorney General signs off on it. And generally, you need to have 7 years of experience practicing as a lawyer. They have tended to try to favor people who have in-court experience and obviously who have immigration backgrounds, but not exclusively. As I said, at the time I was hired, there were a large number of more liberal advocates from outside of government being hired. More recently, the hiring has been more government prosecutors, people who were ICE attorneys, or working for oil. There was a period in the 80s, I'm sorry, not in the 80s, in the early 2000s under the Bush administration, where it was really very politically oriented. There was this whole investigator general report that you can read online where they talked about how they were going over people's online social media and making sure that they had the right views on the right conservative topics before they would be chosen, it's really varied depending on who's in power, how the process has gone.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also a lot of discussion these days about certain approval ratings and the variance between judges in terms of acceptance denial rates. Do judges get any guidance on that?
Well, I used to be in charge of the advanced asylum training for the immigration judges, and it was very substantive law. And I've been told in the last couple of years it's less about substantive law, and the emphasis is more on efficiency, deciding more cases in less time, and don't worry so much about the intricacies of the law. But there was a very controversial policy that began this past October 1st, in which the judges for the first time were subjected to these completion quotas, where they have, when they log onto their computers in the morning, they actually have this thing they look at called the dashboard. And it looks like an animated dashboard. There are these, I think, 7 circles. And these little animated needles within the circles, and it'll be mostly red and then yellow and then a little area of green all the way at the end, and they have to make sure that their needles are all in the green in all of these categories. And some of the criteria is that they're supposed to complete 700 hearings per year, which I think comes out to about 3 or more hearings a day, which, as I said, is very difficult to do these days. And they have to make sure that 95% of the cases are completed at the first time they're set for an individual hearing. They can't be reversed or remanded more than 15% of their decisions. So if, as I said, a judge is trying to interpret a new decision of the Attorney General, and that judge kind of has a theory, hey, I think I can grant it this way. I mean, you usually don't hear back from the appeals for 1.5 years, 2 years. So if that judge gets wrong, they may suddenly start to get all these remands or reversals that'll then put them in jeopardy on that particular meter on the dashboard. So it really is safer to deny it if you're a judge at this point. And as Judge Ashley Tabador, who's a sitting judge in LA and the president of the Judges Union now says, you're not really a judge if you're forced on a daily basis to choose between due process and your own job preservation. And a lot of judges are going to be forced to do that. I noted that 700 number when it first came out. A reporter for our NPR affiliate in New York called me up and said, what does this 700 mean? How is that going to affect New York judges? And without knowing what the answer would be, I said, let's go onto the EUR website and let's look at the court that had the highest denial rate in the country for asylum, which was Atlanta. And we just on our own added up all of the completions that year and divided it by the number of judges, and they were deciding an average of 1,500 cases a year in a high denial court. I said, now let's do the same thing for New York, which is considered one of the more liberal high grant rate courts, and the judges were averaging about, I think, 560 completions a year. So it shows you that 700 isn't just this neutral number. It's easier to get to that number if you're denying, if you're not listening to all the testimony of experts, if you're not reserving decisions to give long, well thought out decisions distinguishing your case from some of these attorney general decisions. If you're just going to basically sit there, give the people an hour to present whatever they're going to present and deny it, you're going to have no problem meeting those criteria. So I always want to emphasize that I don't think these numbers are neutral in any way.
Got it. And Jeff, it sounds like there are some immigration judges like you who have become advocates for improvements, reform of the system. How did that evolution come about for you? And then how is sort of that cohort of advocates interacted with the system?
Yeah, it's again, keeping with my theme of life is a series of accidents. But I think part of it was there have rarely been a group of former government employees who came from such liberal advocate backgrounds. I had started out as an advocate on immigration and really cut my teeth fighting against the government on some of the asylum reforms in the early 90s, and so did many of the others. But I was actually, I think we all reached the point where, because we were hired in the 90s, we had reached minimum retirement age, and also the present climate made people realize, I felt like a moth drawn back to a flame. I know where I'm supposed to be in this fight, and it's not working for the government. And I think a lot of my colleagues had the same feeling. But it was actually my last day working at the BIA. I was on Amtrak, and I got a call from Debbie Anker, who is like this hero and pioneer in the field of asylum law, particularly gender-based asylum. She heads the clinical program at Harvard Law School, and she said, I need your help on something, because there was this remand of a case from the Supreme Court that was now being contested by this administration, and they thought it would be very helpful to have a brief of former judges on one particular part of it. So I had a short period of time. I managed to round up 6 colleagues, and 7 of us were on that brief. And then we did one a few months later where it was 14 of us, and now I think there are 39 former judges in our group. We've done more than 20 briefs. We filed a brief in the U.S. Supreme Court recently. We were named by the American Immigration Lawyers Association as the winner of their 2019 Advocacy Award. And it's just very rewarding. We've been putting out press statements. We've written letters to the director of VIOR when we feel he's done things that weren't fair. And I can't even keep track of all the requests of things for us to do these days. So I think it's very rewarding because, first of all, in retirement, I feel you want to feel like you're still doing something useful and important. But I feel here are a lot of people that had all of this knowledge and didn't feel that they had the voice that they wanted. And now suddenly they're able to come out with all of that government experience and really voice things that they've wanted to voice for a while. So it's really a great group. Maybe you can have some of the others come in for talks like this. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't want to take away from the advocacy efforts, but I think we certainly appreciate what is keeping everyone so busy these days. So would love your take in terms of, let's say, 3 to 5 of the most concerning immigration developments that you've seen and are actively responding to?
Yeah, I keep saying when I'm asked by reporters, you have to look at it as pieces in a puzzle. I don't look at each of these developments as being separate, standalone. And really what's been happening is the administration is trying to, what the Southern Poverty Law Center recently called weaponize the immigration court, rather than it being this neutral place that would sort of keep the administration honest by saying, oh, we can't go too far because the judges will call us out on that. Instead, make the judges part of the process that they're using to further their policies. And right now, their policies are so politically driven to try to just deport more people more quickly and have fewer and fewer people that'll qualify for asylum. So I mean, I could go into the individual components of it, but what bothered me the most, I think, were the Attorney General's increased use of this certification power. And just to explain a little bit about what that means, there's this strange, archaic regulation, I guess, that allows an Attorney General to just take any decision of the Board of Immigration Appeals that they don't like and just vacate it and rewrite it in their own view. And this was left over from 1940, when the Board of Immigration Appeals was first created and only had limited decision-making power. So at that point, anything that was a little too complicated had to be referred to the Attorney General. But we're now way past that. We have people with the expertise and experience that far surpasses the Attorney Generals on the Board of Immigration Appeals. And it was something that, for that reason, was only used rarely under prior administrations for the most part. But now it's just become this quick, easy way for the Attorney General to undo anything he doesn't want without having to go through the proper process, which would be actually changing the law or publishing regulations and allowing for comment. So he's been using it in ways that both take away a lot of immigration judges' freedoms and some of the tools they use to manage their dockets, and then, as I said, again, impose his views of how he wants the law to be, even though the law has evolved a different way over so many years through so many court decisions. So that's very disturbing. I think also the fact that you've got so many people detained, newly arriving, being detained in these remote centers near the border. You hear so many horrible stories of young children being detained and not being given access to showers or to soap or to other things, separating the husbands from their wives and children, separating parents from the children. What that's doing is just horrific in terms of the long-term psychological damage. But it's really designed to make people just give up and say, I'm not going to pursue this. I'm just going to go home and not pursue my rights in this country. And then many of those that are being detained in remote detention centers and really in the middle of nowhere. One of the cases that in the 10th Circuit that our group was asked to write a brief on was somebody that was detained in New Mexico. In I think it was called Cibola, and I looked it up on Google Map, and it was like, it should be the definition of the middle of nowhere. Like there was nothing. I think the closest city or town was a place called Truth or Consequences, New Mexico.
Great names.
And there were, I forget how many 100 people being detained there, and one of the big firms had canvassed lawyers that were within like a 2 or 3 hour drive, and I think there might have been 20 that would be willing to drive there to represent somebody. And then to add to the difficulty, the cases were actually being heard at the immigration court in Denver, which was another, I forget how many hours away. So besides from the fact that it makes it almost impossible to get a lawyer, and I think your chances when you have a lawyer are 5 or 7 times greater of winning. The limited, if you were going to represent yourself, there was such a limited amount of resources, and most of it was in English or Spanish, and in this case involved somebody that spoke a rare East African language. So it really dooms somebody if they're being held in this place where they virtually have no chance of getting a lawyer and no resources to use to prepare their cases.
Yeah, and have lawyers been able to kind of respond to warehousing children, families in remote locations?
Well, I mean, there have been all of these great initiatives. So many, groups have been involved in there. I have individual lawyers that call me and they just say, I went down there and I saw this, and now let's brainstorm on what we can do. So there's a lot of good things going on, but it's really a war of attrition, I feel. The administration feels how many lawyers and firms can keep this up for how long. And they've also tried to put a chilling effect. The Remain in Mexico is another problematic thing, because they've actually put lawyers' names on lists where when they try to enter Mexico, they're told that they're on some kind of blacklist, and they, in a couple of cases, they wouldn't allow lawyers with one of a group that's been particularly active down there. And lawyers have told me that when they cross into Tijuana from San Diego, when they come back, they're sent for secondary inspection, and they ask them to show them the contents of their electronic devices. These are U.S. citizens and lawyers who are just doing their jobs, and they're kind of harassed. And say, what do you think about the policy that we have down here on immigration? So there's a lot of things being done to discourage lawyers from being involved down there. But again, I think, when you see the successes, and you say, well, here's one of the few that was lucky enough to get a great lawyer and then have a big firm come on and to get our group to do an amicus brief. But for every one of those, there's so many that never had that chance, or that were just so sickened or harmed by what was being done to them that they didn't even stick around to pursue it.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I clerked on the First Circuit and the immigration appeals, all of which were so compelling, and you realize that those were the lucky few that actually had counsel and firms to represent them. Now, you talked about family separation and the children who do come with a parent. Have you noticed any changes when it comes to unaccompanied minors in recent years?
I don't deal too much with those cases. I know at New Sanctuary and other groups, I'm friends with Lenny Benson at New York Law School, who founded the Safe Passage Project. But myself, I don't really have enough involvement with that.
Mm-hmm. And then, I know you talked a little bit about, some of the negative, detrimental changes. I'm hoping we can end on a high note in terms of the webcast. Could you talk a little bit about any positive developments that you've seen?
I think in spite of all of the efforts of this administration, I think you still are seeing some very good judges, both old ones and some of the new ones, who I think the administration might have hoped would be tougher, who are being open-minded, who are doing the right thing, who are granting cases, who are listening to the arguments. I feel that there's so much great cooperation between so many people on our side, the lawyers, the former judges, so many advocates, so many lay people getting involved at the New Sanctuary Coalition, where I volunteer. I just want to hug everybody there. It's just so many wonderful people that give so much of themselves and aren't lawyers, but are really doing some very complicated things with assistance and supervision from lawyers.
And can you describe that coalition just for a minute?
Yeah, that was a group that is based in Judson Church in Greenwich Village in New York, and it's led by somebody named Ravi Ragbeer, who himself has an outstanding removal order, but has become a really high-profile activist in terms of immigration and immigrants. And they have a clinic on Tuesday nights, which large numbers of lay people form these teams where they really form a bond with, we call them friends that come in. And the friends will come back week after week. You'll often walk in and there will be kids crawling on the floor. And they really, do become friends over time. And then there will be 6 or 8 lawyers like myself running around like in a emergency room in a hospital saying, okay, what seems to be the problem here? Okay, here's what we should do. And then we'll come back in a week or two and see how it's going. And they do an amazing job of making sure that people don't miss their court hearing dates. They help people with the changes of venues on those types of cases we talked about, where they're now in New York. They file asylum applications to make sure people don't miss their 1-year deadline, and they've really been doing great work. And we've had people that have gone through because they couldn't get a lawyer, just with the assistance of New Sanctuary, that have won their asylum claims. They also have, I think, a great accompaniment program where nobody goes to court or to their check-in or to anything in immigration alone. They come often with a team of 5 or 6 people who sit there with them and explain things to them, because it's a scary experience. Even my own clients, just going for a master calendar hearing where you tell them this is nothing's going to happen, still tell me I couldn't sleep last night and they're so nervous. So to be able to go in with a group of people like that is really wonderful.
Well, and we spoke with Ravi. We launched actually a campaign here called the United Sanctuaries of America, USA, at the start of July, and as part of that effort had reached out to Ravi, and it was incredible to hear from him how the volunteer trainings, there had been such a marked uptick in participation in the number of people who are not just going to prayer vigils, but are asking the question of, what can I myself do, even if you're not a trained attorney. And I think it's pretty compelling to see just citizens who are responding.
I think we live in an age where often being active is limited to posting something snarky on Twitter. Yeah. And I think where you can really get people into a room hands-on, and you know, my wife has volunteered there, my daughter has volunteered there, and my wife had a mother who had been separated from her son when they were doing the separations at the border for I think 4 months. The son was 8, and then they were paroled out, and she was wearing an ankle bracelet. And you know, amongst the immigration, besides from the immigration things, she was having trouble getting the son registered for school. And my wife went out to where they live and spent a whole day at the school and got the son registered. And she even bought him a backpack. And the next morning, we got this text of him with his backpack proudly going to the school, and we all had tears, you know, running down our cheeks. So there's just so much good, I think, that's coming out of that kind of thing. And I also tell, you know, the young lawyers now who are often discouraged and scared. I said, I was a young lawyer, you know, when I went through this the first time in the early 90s, and it will get better. It always does. And then the other thing is it will get worse, and when it does, because you've been through this now, you'll be able to step up at that point and say, hey, I've been through this before and I know how this works, and you'll be able to be a leader to the next generation of advocates.
And then do you stay in touch with kind of your fellow or prior immigration judges? Like, do you sense that there's an internal movement happening as well in response to some of the changes?
Yeah, people are very, you know, it used to be you did your career and you retired and you went fishing. And I think people now are coming out so, you know, just so full of, I want to do something, I want to do something. And it's, you know, I think not just with the judges, but I think all the people that were advocates were just drawn back together. People I hadn't spoken to, you know, in 20, 25 years are suddenly back in touch, and it's, although it's a horrible time, it's just a really nice community at this point, and people are so supportive and working together. And I hope this builds something permanent, that it's not just a passing phase. But I think so. These are good people, and they, you know, these days with it's so easy to stay in touch with people as compared to, you know, when I first started in this field through email and social media. So I think there will be a number of positive things that'll come out of this period.
And if there's one thing that you're kind of specifically focused on changing, impacting, could you identify?
Well, I mean, you know, we could spend the next 3 hours, but you know, I'm particularly pushing for taking the immigration courts out of the Department of Justice, because the Department of Justice is an enforcement-based agency. It's not designed to be neutral. It's not designed to be immune from political pressures, and moving them into a separate Article I court. And that's something that the Immigration Judges Union has been advocating for. I think because they've been so successful at getting members of Congress to listen, the government just, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, moved to decertify the union, thinking that would silence them. But I think that's something that's picking up steam, and obviously wouldn't solve all the problems, but would be a good first step, I think, in making them, again, a neutral, independent group that wouldn't be pressured by for political reasons to decide things a certain way.
And for lay listeners, can you just describe what an Article I court is versus...
Oh, yes. Because
for us non-lawyers.
Yeah, well, I think our president recently said there's this thing called Article II that nobody knows about, and it gives me it lets me do anything I want. But there's also an Article I and an Article III. Maybe he hasn't gotten up to those yet. But Article I is Congress, obviously, and because the power over immigration is delegated to the Congress, that this would be a court that would be under their auspices, but would be outside of the executive branch. I think most of the courts that we're used to hearing about the circuit courts and the district courts or Article 3, which is just the judiciary, but there are also courts within Articles 1 and 2.
That's great. That's helpful. Thank you. And it doesn't have to be limited to one, but for those in the room, obviously I think we're blessed enough that through our work we can impact some of these issues, but for people who are listening, if there's 1 or 2, 3 things that you would like them to do, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think volunteering somewhere. I mean, I think there are groups like New Sanctuary Coalition, but I think there are just, any group at this point that I think is helping newly arrived people. And, we focus on the immigration aspect, but I think people need help. You just suddenly find yourself in a new place, need help in a lot of different ways. But I think any way that actually allows you to connect with the immigrants. So much of this is I think so much of the government strategy is dehumanizing. And I remember back in the early 90s, I said as long as it's about numbers, it's always going to sound terrible. This many thousands are coming. But I had written an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that was maybe in 93 or 94 that was about a mother and her 3-year-old daughter from Iran who were detained. And I was going to see the mother in a detention center, and we were speaking in Farsi, and the mother said, "Don't mention about jail because I don't want my daughter to realize we're in jail." And then once they were released, I was with her, and we walked out. It had to be released at the airport because it was at night. And the daughter immediately says, Mama, azad shodim, mommy, we're free, like 2 steps out. And she had realized all along, that they were in jail. And then, that became the theme of the op-ed. It's much more compelling, than 17,000 this and, So I feel once we connect with people and realize they're people like us and realize what their problems are, we're really building something more than just, okay, next case. And I think the government wants it to be a numbers game. So.
Yeah, well, I think that's a nice. Okay. I was about to say I was about to wrap up, but I realized that we may have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if that's all right.
So obviously retrospect is always 2020, but thinking about did creating it as a court system backfire in a way? So that now it's become this formalized court in which there's a prosecutor and a judge that is supposed to be neutral but now is not potentially as neutral. Like if we talk here a lot about refugee resettlement 2.0, if we were to create immigration court 2.0, do you think immigration judges still encourage it to develop in the way that it has?
And I'll just repeat for the feed. If there were sort of an immigration judge and courts 2.0, would we recreate it in the same way that we've seen the development?
Well, I think it being more like courts is still better than what would have the alternative been. Because if it was just somebody working for DHS now, I mean, they would just tell them this is what you have to do and that would be it. Mm-hmm. But now still, as I said, even though they're being told you shouldn't be granting these types of cases, plenty of them are. And if they're not, there's still a way you can now appeal it because it's a court decision up the ladder, and we're, we have a lot of these issues now pending in the circuit court. So I still think that was a good deal to make it more court-like, so that you have these things. When Sessions or Barr has rendered these decisions, the fact that he renders it as a decision is helpful because I don't think whoever's writing them knows immigration law very well. And we always seem to be able to find, hey, you can still grant the cases, and here's how. So.
Other questions? Okay, well then please, Tim.
I'm curious, kind of, what's the path forward in jurisdictions where approval rates are so low? Kind of, what do advocates think is the path forward where there's so much discretion given to judges, and we know that they're not impartial any longer? And so, like in Atlanta, kind of what what recourse is there, or is there a path forward to kind of combat what seem like kind of absurdly low approval numbers, and just seems like probably a violation of due process for these folks who are in proceedings.
Okay, so the question from the audience is, what's the path forward in locations where the approval rates are so low, giving the example of Atlanta?
Yeah, and two of those Atlanta judges, by the way, were just named to the Board of Immigration Appeals a few days ago. But I think one of them has a 98.6% denial rate on asylum, which always makes me wonder about that other 1.4%.
Yeah.
But I was tasked with that exact thing about 11 or 12 years ago, because there was a lot of focus on the disparity, how one judge could be granting 98% of a certain type of case in New York, and another one could be denying 98% of the same types of cases in Miami. And Eeyore had asked me to see if there was a way, what would work or what wouldn't work, and it wasn't really clear. I think a lot of it has to do with what circuit you're located in. So because Atlanta is in a more conservative circuit that isn't going to push back against the judges, that's part of it. I had spoken to a person in Canada who was in charge of their country condition evidence, and he said in Canada, to some degree, increasingly educating the judges in disparate grant or denial courts on the country conditions and on the law had some impact. And as I said, I don't think the judges at this point are getting sufficient training in the actual legal part of it, or in the country condition part. It's more about how to move the line faster, so that may be part of it. But I don't know that there's really an answer to that. I think always Atlanta is going to be a denier court, and New York and San Francisco, for example, are going to be more liberal courts.
And Jeff, I know you've been running around the country, and a question about what you view as your greatest success may require 3 hours, but if we might end with a moment of personal reflection, what do you think of as your greatest success in terms of fighting this good fight?
I don't really think of it. I kind of feel like it's this unfinished, ongoing project, and I think I was raised more hearing criticism than praise, so
Sounds
I'm not
familiar.
really the type that
Take a moment.
Okay, so I'm not really the type to focus on my successes as much as on my failures, or where can we still improve. But I guess at this point I would say the fact that that I was integral to forming this group of former judges, and that we're able to add value, I assume, from how much we're being asked to do, is something that I'm very proud of at this point.
Well, it's really excited to see the work that you've done along with your fellow former immigration judges. So thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us.
Thank you
we really appreciate it.
for having me, really, and keep doing all the great work that you and your group are doing.